Fellas, now that Ilia Topuria's knocked out Alexander Volkanovski, Max Holloway, and Charles Oliveira back-to-back-to-back, he's 17-0 undefeated, and he's now pound-for-pound #1. I think it's safe to say nobody's ever beaten Ilia Topuria. And we've had some mythical fighters in the UFC before, C-level Kane, motivated McGregor, but I feel like confident Topuria as a mythical fighter might be the best one we've had yet. And like I said, nobody's beaten this dude. If we look at some potential fighters at 155 and 170, and even if he went up there and said, for sure I'll beat Aspinall, I've got to favour him against Tom Aspinall these days, but some potential lightweight contenders, Tsarukyan, Paddy, Pimblett, and Justin Gaethje are probably going to be next for Ilia Topuria. They're all at UFC 317. They all make the most sense. But if we start off with Justin Gaethje, Ilia Topuria versus Justin Gaethje, I'm going to be honest, this is a waste of a title shot. Justin Gaethje's on a one-fight win streak over a guy that he's beat before on short notice, went to a decision. He got brutally KO'd by Max Holloway, the guy who Topuria just KO'd a fight ago. He's 0-2 in title shots. There's zero hype, zero rivalry, and there's just 0 point in Justin Gaethje versus Ilia Topuria. At least with Tsarukyan, he's the most deserving, and with Paddy, Pimblett, it will be the best selling. What can you do with Justin Gaethje? There's no reason he should be chosen, and considering that we've just seen Topuria knock out Volkanovski, Holloway, and Oliveira, I think it's pretty safe to say that a guy like Justin Gaethje, who likes to brawl, would probably end up getting slept by Ilia Topuria in the first round. So Justin Gaethje, he can get in the bin. And then we've got Paddy Pimblett. Now, this has been a rivalry that's been going on since 2022. Probably one of the biggest rivalries in the UFC right now. They've had a massive rivalry for years. They've both got the Octagon at UFC 317. And this would probably be one of the biggest fights the UFC can put in 2025. This would sell so many pay-per-views. Topuria versus Paddy Pimblett. It would be a super fight. And to be fair, Paddy Pimblett brings a kind of unique style. He's not going to stand and trade with Topuria. He's going to try and take the fight down with the wrestling and dominate the fight with his BJJ that he normally doesn't need fights. He wants to dominate Topuria with the grappling. But with that being said, it's easy said than done. And we're probably going to see Paddy Pimblett get chinned. He said Scousers can't get knocked out. Well, Scousers haven't fought Ilia Topuria. I'm pretty confident, and most people would be, that Topuria finds the chin of Paddy Pimblett and remains the lightweight champion. So even though Paddy Pimblett will be a fun build-up, I think he probably gets slept by Topuria, which then brings on to Arman Tsarukyan. Now, what we'll say, Arman Tsarukyan is probably the toughest test for Ilia at 155. I mean, first of all, he's the only other guy apart from Makhachev to have a win over Oliveira recently, and it's the wrestling of Arman Tsarukyan. He's going to bring a new style. He's not going to stand and trade or have a dogfight with Ilia Topuria. He is, you know, some of the best wrestling in this division. He dominates fights with the wrestling. I'd say he is probably the best wrestler at 155 right now that Makhachev's list. He's not one-dimensional either. He's got decent striking. He knocked out Dariush. He's got pretty decent striking in the division. But I will say this, Ilia Topuria is a better striker, he's got better BJJ, he's more dangerous, and he's got the aura that he's picked up recently. And we've seen Tsarukyan before against Joaquim Silva. He got wobbled badly against Joaquim Silva, who was a journeyman at the time. If Joaquim Silva is able to wobble Tsarukyan and nearly get him out of there, I'm pretty sure it's safe to say that Topuria probably gets the KO of Arman Tsarukyan, or at least at the very least gets the decision whenever Tsarukyan. Tsarukyan's definitely a tough test, toughest at 155, but I've got to go with Topuria by some sort of TKO, or at least a decision. So there isn't really any potential lightweight contenders I see being a threat to Topuria. And even if we just look at the division from top to bottom, he's already knocked out Oliveira and Holloway. Dustin Poirier is going to retire. That's never going to be a fight. I think Topuria would probably easily knock out Dan Hooker. Mateus Gamrot, bro, lost to Hooker. He ain't getting to Topuria. He's never going to get to that fight anyway. And I've still a lot of people mentioning Mauricio Houfi versus Ilia Topuria. Is this Houfi's going to be one to beat him? I mean, first of all, don't get me wrong. Houfi's very talented. Probably the best prospect right now at 155. But you can't say because he beat an old, senile Bobby Green that he'd be competitive with Ilia Topuria. And let's not forget, a fight ago, this guy lost the last round and looked didn't look beatable, but lost the last round against James Lontop and looked to be starting to gas out. Topuria just simply owns lightweight. I don't see there being any major threat to Topuria at 155 or anybody that I would favour to beat Ilia at 155, which brings us on to the next conversation, which is 170. Topuria's made it very clear he wants to move up to the welterweight division. He said he wants to be the first guy to win a belt in 3 different weight classes. He wants to get a shot at 170, and there's no bigger fight at 170 right now than Islam Makhachev. Now, had Belal Muhammad not fucked everything up and beaten Jack Madlena, we would have seen Makhachev versus Topuria last week instead of having to watch Oliveira get knocked out. But I think what the UFC are probably going to do is let Topuria defend his belt, hope that Makhachev can beat JDM, and then they're going to do the big massive fight at 170. Ilia Topuria versus Islam Makhachev, which might be the biggest fight in modern UFC history, at least one of the biggest in the history of the sport. I mean, pound for pound #1 versus pound for pound #2, 27-1 versus 17, you know, the immovable object versus the unstoppable force. Makhachev versus Topuria is probably the biggest fight, probably by far the biggest fight you can make in mixed martial arts right now, and it is fairly 50-50. However, I'm slightly, ever so slightly leaning towards Ilia Topuria. And this is because, listen, Makhachev is a killer for anyone. He is not an easy fight for anybody. But we've seen him look beatable before. The first fight with Volkanovski made him look very beatable in that fight. Arguably won the first fight as well. Really good anti-grappling, was beating him on the feet in most of the exchanges. Even in the Dustin Poirier fight, don't get me wrong, Makhachev was dominating the fight. But Poirier was able to make it into a dogfight. He won rounds on the scorecard against Islam Makhachev. And Topuria, stylistically, he's just so much better than both of those guys. I feel like Topuria definitely has the capabilities to KO him, especially with what Topuria's been doing recently. I favour Topuria to beat Makhachev ever so slightly at this moment in time. And even other potential welterweights. If Belal Muhammad was still a champion, I think Topuria easily keeps the fight standing and chins Belal Muhammad within 5 rounds. Jack Della Maddalena, now I will say, JDM is a terrible fight for Ilia Topuria. He's one of the most slick boxers in the UFC, definitely the most slick boxer at welterweight. He's known for having really good anti-grappling that he just showed against Belal Muhammad, and he's massive as well. He's a big 170 guy, is JDM. He'd be a huge size difference compared to Ilia. But like I said, this new confident Ilia Topuria, this new mythical fighter, honestly, if Topuria was confident that he beats JDM, I'm sure he'd find a way to do it, and I think he is one of the only guys in the UFC's history that has potential, and I might actually favour to be a champion in 3 different weight classes. And even if he did stay in the featherweight division, you look at the featherweight rankings, he's already beat Volkanovski and Max Holloway. I think he probably starches Diego Lopez. I think he'd probably end up beating Yair Rodriguez. I think he mauls Yair Rodriguez. If you said to Topuria, you can't throw a single strike against Yair Rodriguez, I'm sure he'd still find a way to beat him. And Movsar Evloev, people say that Evloev, you know, Topuria was running from Evloev. I think that's a fairly easy fight for Topuria. Evloev arguably lost to Arnold Allen. Topuria chins him. He'd keep the fight standing and shin Evloev within 3. And what about the other all-time greats of the sport? Guys like Jose Aldo, Prime McGregor, even Khabib at 155. We've started off with Aldo. Aldo was so skilled in his prime. Some and most would probably consider him the greatest featherweight of all time because of the run and how unbeatable he looked like in his prime. And he was one of the greatest of all time. I think top 5 greatest in UFC history. But with that being said, Topuria slumps Aldo. And I think most of the top modern generation fighters beat Jose Aldo even in his prime. And Topuria said it before. I feel I represent the new generation of mixed martial arts. And for that reason, I do feel like Topuria would be able to chin Jose Aldo if they were to fight. And I think he'd do it fairly early on. And then we've got the infamous fight, Conor McGregor versus Ilia Topuria, prime for prime. This would be a super interesting matchup because, again, similar to the Makhachev fight, it would be a super fight of styles. Motivated McGregor versus confident Topuria. 7-0 versus 15-0. Conor McGregor in his prime that seemed pretty much unbeatable. He had perfect range. He was able to counter everybody. Looked unstoppable in the featherweight division. But Ilia Topuria is just so much more balanced than Conor McGregor. I mean, look at McGregor in the Chad Mendes fight even. Chad Mendes was able to rough Conor McGregor up, even with the grappling in that fight, and make him look very beatable. And that was McGregor's interim title fight. I think Topuria would definitely have the capability to submit Conor McGregor and even KO on the feet. If I had to pick a winner, I'd probably go to Topuria by TKO. I think he's a much more complete fighter than Conor McGregor in his prime at the featherweight division. And this isn't really an unpopular opinion as well. Most people seem to think that Topuria is, you know, what McGregor should have been. Most people think Topuria would beat McGregor in a fight, and I have to agree. And then Khabib versus Ilia Topuria. Now, I will say this. Even in his most recent fight with Charles Oliveira was able to trip Ilia Topuria. And even though Topuria was able to get the dominant position, I'm not sure he could do that against Khabib. We've even seen Bryce Mitchell before able to take to Ilia Topuria down and maintain dominant position. And we're talking about the most dominant wrestler in UFC history with Khabib. So I think that Khabib most likely beats Ilia Topuria, but Topuria's expressed in it, you know, an admiration for a fight with Khabib. He's expressed interest in this fight, prime for prime. And if anybody's going to pull it off, it's going to be Ilia Topuria. So as much as I want to favour Khabib to win this fight, Topuria could get it done, but I would lean towards Khabib winning that fight. But this is why Topuria will retire undefeated, like I said in the title. First of all, he's here for a good time, not a long time. He said before that he wants to be out the sport by 30 years old, and we've seen many legends in their prime who look really good go on this long losing streak towards the end of their career. Fighters that are stuck around way too long and then have ended up paying the price for it towards the end of their career. Father Time is undefeated, but so is Ilia Topuria, and I think he's only going to have 2 to 3 more fights in his MMA career and then dip from the sport, just like Khabib when he was 29-0 and retired at 32 years old, fairly early on into his title reign. And I think not only will Ilia Topuria retire undefeated, I think he might have the capabilities to become the greatest, undoubtedly the greatest mixed martial artist of all time. Like I said, he's here for a good time, not a long time. And if you look at some of the other goats of the sport, Demetrius Johnson, GSP, Anderson Silva, they've all got really long title wins, 11 title wins, you know, a bunch of title wins between them. And yeah, they've got in these long reigns. And Ilia Topuria, I doubt he's even going to surpass 7 title wins. But one thing I will say about some of the GOATs of the sport is even though they've got a lot of title wins, there's also a lot of filler names in there. Names that aren't really legendary names, aren't really, you know, names that are notable. They've got a lot of filler names in there. Ilia Topuria, he's only had legends so far in his title run, and I think he's only going to stay the same way. He looks to fight Makhachev. He wants to become a welterweight champion. I think there's going to be very limited kind of, you know, filler names in Topuria's legacy. Imagine he ends off his career as the first man to become a champion in 3 different weight classes. A resume of, you know, Makhachev, Volk, Holloway, Oliveira, Paddy, Pimblett, who, you know, is probably the odd one out, and then Tsarukyan. He also ends off with 6 title wins at 20-0. He would undoubtedly be the undefeated, undisputed GOAT. He'd be undefeated. He'd have set records title-wise. He'd have a bunch of title wins, and he would have one of the greatest resumes of all time. And you can say it's recency bias. You might be recency bias. If there is a fighter that I think it's fair to use recency bias against, it's Ilia Topuria with what he's accomplished recently. And he's also the best boxer in the UFC. The only guy I can really compare him to is Dustin Poirier. And I'm going to talk about Dustin Poirier. We're getting into a bit of a new topic now, but the next pay-per-view, they recently announced at UFC 317, UFC 318's main card, and this is absolutely atrocious. I think it's the second worst main card this year. Robert Valentin is on a pay-per-view featured fight. Robert Valentin's 0-2 in the UFC, and he's on a pay-per-view featured fight after just getting held up against the cage by Torres Finney, and he's on Dustin Poirier's retirement card. Even Ige versus Pitbull in the co-main event. This is a co-main event. Dan Ige is a gatekeeper of the UFC. He's 0-7 against ranked fighters. They didn't manage to secure himself a co-main event spot. And Patricio Pitbull got fraud checked in his UFC debut by Yair Rodriguez, coming off a loss in the UFC, and that's a co-main event of a pay-per-view for Dustin Poirier's retirement fight, which isn't even for a real belt. And even the prelims, they've actually got some pretty solid prelims for this card. And I'm also confused how they've kind of structured this card. This is how the card should be structured. The main event should be Max Holloway versus Dustin Poirier. If we're being real, the co-main event, even though it's still weak, it should probably be Marvin Vettori versus Brendan Allen. They're the other highly ranked guys on the card. They've got a bit of a rivalry there that they could build. That should probably be the co-main. The featured fight, maybe then you do Paulo Costa versus Kopylov. Again, 2 guys in the top 15. I think that's a banger of a fight. Then for the 4th fight down, Dan Ige versus Patricio Pitbull. I think it's fair to put that 4th fight down. And then to open up the main card, Kevin Holland, who's probably the most active fighter in the UFC, against D-Rod. But nobody's beating Ilia Topuria. I just thought I'd have to do a quick video about this. And UFC 318 sucks. But Ilia Topuria seems to be on an unstoppable roll right now. And I think everybody at featherweight, lightweight, and even welterweight has to be worried about Ilia Topuria. Or at least maybe not featherweight anymore. But yeah, Ilia Topuria, he's going to retire undefeated. He's going to retire as the greatest of all time. And those are some reasons why I think that.